Hello and welcome to this training session. In this lesson we're going to be looking at Exchange integration and exploring the technology used. If you don't know me, my name is Jeff Richards and I'm the head of training program development for Sage CRM. I work within the development and support teams in Dublin, and I'm responsible for the creation of training resources that cover the programming interfaces, customization capabilities and technical features of Sage CRM. The core intended audience for this presentation are colleagues providing technical support for partners and customers using integrated Sage CRM. We have a very ambitious agenda for this session, and we're going to break it into 5 different sections. First of all, the idea is that we're going to cover the introduction to the Sage CRM Exchange integration itself and have a think about the technology that's being used in the integration. We'll look at the supported software requirements and then the Sage CRM prerequisites. We'll also look at the specific Microsoft Exchange prerequisites and how to ensure that the web services and impersonated user are enabled. Now we'll look at the Exchange environment, the assumptions that we're making, and to test how the Exchange prerequisites have been met. We'll look at the installation and configuration within Sage CRM, and we'll consider the possible points of failure, and then look at exploring and explaining the logs. And we'll also, lastly, move towards the operation of the integration, thinking about that and the different logs, again, that are available, and discuss the possibility of installing and configuring the sync engine on another server. Now, at various times, it's going to be necessary to refer you to the documentation and help center in order to make the best use of the time. But first, let's look at the concepts behind the Sage CRM Exchange integration. Now, the Sage CRM Exchange integration is an integration, as it says, between Sage CRM and the Exchange server. There's no synchronization to individual Outlook clients. The synchronization runs in the background and doesn't require any user triggers. It continues even when the Outlook clients are closed, and what we use is a single impersonated Exchange user to access all of the user's mailboxes so that only one set of credentials are being used in order to access all of the different mailboxes. Now, the appointment task and contacts can be synchronized between Sage CRM and the Exchange server, and the functionality is supported even if the user is working in something like it doesn't matter whether it's the Outlook client, the Outlook web access, or using a mobile device that connects ultimately to Exchange. So, for example, if a sales manager schedules a meeting on the phone, then it's going to trickle through into Exchange, and then it's going to appear inside Sage CRM. And there doesn't need to be anyone needing to open up their laptops or devices to synchronize. As soon as they go into their clients, into their browser, that means it's there. So now there is additional, if you are using Outlook and the Outlook client, there is an additional Outlook Lite plugin that can be installed within the client machine to allow users to add contacts to Sage CRM from the Outlook client, so driving down from Outlook to Sage CRM, and how we can take single emails within Outlook and then actually going to save those into Sage CRM as well, and how we can access Sage CRM documents as inside Outlook as well. So these are all different aspects of the integration. Now, if we think about how, if we're not using the Exchange environment, how we would be doing that, well, that's when we think about moving over into classic Outlook integration. Classic Outlook integration is where all of the synchronization takes place from the however many Outlook clients that we have all the way through to Sage CRM. So lots of different conversations taking place within that integration. Now, that's outlined, if you like, on the right hand side, where you would have the features of what the classic Outlook integration is doing. So Outlook is moving contacts backwards and forwards, tasks are moving backwards and forwards, appointments moving backwards and forwards. So all of these multiple different forms of synchronization taking place. And it's whether it's going to be working on email accounts running on Exchange Server, MAPI, or POP3. That doesn't matter. Just note that in the classic Outlook integration, roaming profiles aren't supported. Now, that's a fairly fat client because it's got to do all of the different work. If we're then moving on to thinking about our Exchange environment where we're using a lightweight plugin, excuse me. Now, in order to use the Light Outlook plugin, you're going to have to install this ActiveX plugin, and the plugin works on both 32-bit and 64-bit plugins. It's available as a client applications.msi installer. So if you don't want users to manually install the Light Outlook plugin, and the reason might be that is you don't have the users don't have the administrative rights to be able on their machines to be able to do that, then you want to be able to deliver that through a group policy. And one of the good things about that is that it is possible to roll out the installation via the Active Directory group policy deployment. There are a little bit more, it's a little bit more tricky than that, so you need to refer to the online documentation because there's the whole question about the .NET framework and the Visual Studio tools for Office Runtime, which are only available is setup.exe format and so can't actually be deployed using group policy. So there's a little bit of additional work that you need to do there. Now, if we summarize what we've got here with the Outlook Lite plugin, is that the plugin contains no sync logic at all, and so this is because all the synchronization is taking place between the Exchange server and the Sage CRM server directly. So there's no manual syncing with inside Sage CRM. Now, it's going to work as well whether you're using, let's assume that you're using, instead of asking each user to sign on with their individual usernames and passwords into Sage CRM, and let's assuming you're using IIS auto login, that's supported as well within the client, the Outlook client as well. That has implications for licensing. So the Lite Outlook plugin would consume a concurrent license if the user is filing emails and adding contacts in Outlook using the plugin, because obviously you're talking through to Sage CRM. But if the user then opens up the browser, so they're using both interacting with Sage CRM through the browser and also through Sage CRM's browser interface, then there's only one concurrent user being used, or concurrent user license being used. If that's on a different machine though, so if you're a second user is logged on to Sage CRM using a browser, then that's when two different users' licenses are used up. And the licenses are freed up when you close Outlook or when the Sage CRM session expires. Okay. Let's have a look and let's consider the idea of the supported environments. For Sage, we can think about the idea of where we are at the moment, and that's Sage CRM 2018 R3. Sage CRM can integrate and work with the following Exchange versions. That's Exchange Server 2016, Exchange Server 2013 SP1. Both of those are the 64-bit editions, and we can also connect through to Exchange Online, which is part of the Office 365 family. Now, in all of the Exchange versions, we need to be able to connect to them using web services, and this is the Exchange web services, so they must be enabled. We also need to use a user that has rights over impersonation, that is able to carry out tasks, so we have to log on as an Exchange user through the web services, and that user has to be able to perform interactions with other people's mailboxes, creating tasks and appointments on their behalf. And we need to also be able to provide the credentials for that process, and that has to use anonymous authentication. Now, please note that this can be the stumbling point in which we don't allow for Sage and Exchange integration to take place, because some third-party Exchange providers don't allow anonymous authentication to be enabled, so this can be an immediate stumbling block for our integration. Right, well, it is also possible to deploy the Exchange server within a virtualized environment. And Microsoft provides best practice guides for both Exchange 2013 and Exchange 2016. And the Sage CRM has been, of course, tested within a VMware environment, but we think that it should be able to run on any standard virtualized environment as well, though ultimately configuration, setup and performance of the virtualized environment are the responsibility of the customer's own IT department. Within a large-scale implementation of Sage CRM, so we're thinking about a multiple CRM implementation, so you've got multiple CRM servers, in which case all of those different CRM servers are going to share the same sync engine location. So they're not going to be duplicating, they're having their own sync engines, they're all going to be pointing through to a single sync engine. So this is part of the scaling up. That's all defined within connection management, but please be aware that ultimately they all go through to the same common database. That ability to work within a multi-server environment allows customers to make the best use of server resources available to them, and here you can see that different servers can undertake different shared tasks. We'll return to moving off the sync engine off to a different server in a little bit, right at the end of the presentation. But let's have a look at what are the prerequisites for Microsoft Exchange. So there are a number of different basic steps that need to be followed in order to enable Exchange integration. Before we do anything, we should always make sure that we've backed up the Exchange server before attempting any of this. Then we need to make sure that we are using the correct Exchange server, which has access to the Exchange Web Services API, which in turn supports impersonated users. We need to be able to expose the Exchange Web Services virtual directory so that the impersonated user can read the schema from the Exchange Web Services endpoint. We need to be able to have that Exchange impersonated user be able to access the mailboxes of the other Exchange users, and we need to make sure that the Exchange integration is using the correct authentication to be able to access the data, and we need to be able to then also create a connection from Sage CRM to the sync engine and from the sync engine to the Exchange server so that the data can be synchronized between all of those applications. Now, I've mentioned that Sage CRM is using Exchange impersonation. Now, we need to have an account created that can be within Exchange that can be used by Sage CRM to read the calendar, the contacts database of all the other users. That is called Exchange impersonation. There's a whole set of background information available to you if you go to the Microsoft website, and the URL is on the screen, and that explains how to configure impersonation generally. Now, this Exchange user does not have to exist as a user inside Sage CRM. So Sage CRM is going to connect to it using this impersonated user, their credentials, and that user has to be able to perform the tasks inside Sage CRM, inside Exchange. Now, what enables this is something called the client access server. Now, this is a particular role that's enabled inside an Exchange server, and the client access server performs a number of functions, including, importantly, exposing the Exchange Web Services virtual directory. And so you'd need to be able to potentially work with the customer's Exchange administrator to ensure that this is installed or reinstalled on the Exchange server. That has to be available. And there's a bit of an explanation there on the Exchange architecture, understanding the idea of the EWS applications. Now, the user that's going to make any of the changes, so you have to have an Exchange user that has to have, and a Windows user that has to be logged onto the server with domain administrator credentials, and you have to have permission to be able to create and assign roles and scopes within inside Exchange. Now that means if you're going to be able to run commands within inside the Exchange management shell in order to do this, you're going to have rights on the Exchange server. So you're going to have administrative credentials on the Exchange server, domain administrator credentials, and any other credentials to assign the roles and scopes, and as well as obviously having the Exchange management tools. This probably means that you're going to need to work with the administrator from the customer in order to achieve everything that you want. Let's step back and think about a little bit more about the client access server. The client access server is this thing that is used within inside Exchange to expose not only the Exchange web services, but it's also the thing that exposes the Outlook web access as well as enabling POP3 and IMAP4 interaction with the mailboxes. But that knowledge that as soon as you've got the Exchange web services, that you're going to have the Outlook web access as well is very useful when it comes to thinking about the initialization of the account. Now I'm now looking at a diagram which is called Exchange integration. This is providing an illustration how the different Sage CRM features work together. Now imagine that you've got all of the users within inside Exchange set up. So you've got maybe 20 different email accounts and email boxes. They're going to be working across through into an Active Directory server as well. The chances are that you're using Active Directory to manage all the users within the network. Those users can be accessed inside Sage CRM using because it's an LDAP server, using a feature within inside Sage CRM called Active Directory Provisioning. So basically you can import all of the different Exchange users all the way through into Sage CRM. Those users can then be enabled for Exchange integration. The Exchange integration is turned on, if you like, and we're going to be using a particular set of configurations. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but let's assume that we've got this sync engine, also known as the replication engine, and that's going to connect through to the end service, the web services endpoint, which is exposed because of the client access server within inside Exchange. So there's that cycle of Exchange integration with inside Sage CRM. Now the Exchange account that Sage CRM is using has to have the correct permissions to access all the other mailboxes. This is what we're talking about, impersonation rights. And that has to be able to allow us to create, read, update, delete, calendar entries, and the contacts for all of the different Exchange users. Generally, what would happen is that you would create the user using the Exchange Management Console as normal. You'd then associate it with a mailbox. Now, if you're going to do that, then a good tip is to make sure that the user is set up with a password that never expires. Otherwise, you'd be faced with the problem that whenever the policy says the particular password could expire, and then the Exchange integration just stops working. But let's assume that you've set up your user, you've got their mail account, then you need to be able to grant those users rights through the Exchange management shell. The exact process is going to differ depending on the version of Exchange, but you could potentially be using multiple Exchange servers. If there's only ever one single EWS endpoint that we need to worry about. There is only one EWS endpoint, Exchange Web Services endpoint, that we need to worry about. But let's have a look about setting up this user. So we configure the user. We've got our client access server all enabled on the Exchange server. We're going to set up the domain administrator credentials. We are going to be using Powershell to be able to grant the rights. And what we do then is that we have Exchange Management Shell that allows commandments to be run. This is something the administrator, the actual Exchange administrator, is likely to do for us. So commandlets are the short commands specific to the PowerShell environment of the particular Exchange version, Exchange Management Shell that you're using. And so different commandlets are used depending on what you're doing. And there's more than one way of achieving the end goal. So we know what we have to do, but the Exchange administrator may prefer to use a different commandlet to make the required settings. And whatever you're doing, a commandlet instruction needs to be entered as a single line, and each commandlet will then return a result to indicate the success or failure, and you'll be able to receive errors or rather, if you do receive errors, you're going to need to discuss those with the Exchange administrator. Now let's assume that we've got the Exchange Management Shell working, and the command that we want to use then in 2010, in 2013 and 2016 is new management role assignment. This adds the permission to impersonate the specified user. The Microsoft Exchange Server adopts a role-based access control, RBAC, allowing extremely broad or extremely precise permission to be granted, modelled on the roles of administrators and users. And so there are commands that will allow this, and we just need to be aware that the user that we're going to be addressing is the account created in Exchange to carry out the task on behalf of Sage CRM. So those commandments are going to look like something like new management role assignment, with the name being the impersonation assignment name, and the role being, and importantly here, the role is application impersonation, with then the user being whoever we're granting that to. Now that configures the Exchange impersonation to enable whichever is the username that we used to impersonate all other users. And the name that we mentioned there is the friendly name of the role assignment. So when a role is assigned, an entry is made into the RBAC. Well, once we've got our Exchange user created and we've granted them the correct impersonation rights, then that user has to be initialized. The easiest way to do that is to use the Outlook Web Access to log on as the impersonated user, and that will initialize it. And we also need to then also set the authentication permissions for the EWS. The important thing is that we are using anonymous authentication, and as I said, some third-party Exchange providers do not allow anonymous authentication to be enabled. So we've got now, hopefully, all of the things set up with inside Exchange that we require to do. And there are a number of tools that allow us to test this. So we have a web services endpoint. There'll only be one that we need to worry about. No matter how many Exchange servers a particular network will be using, there'll be one network endpoint that the system administrator for the Exchange server will be able to provide you with. So that's going to be in the form of whatever the domain is, /ews/exchange.asmx. We can then use a testing tool, and there's a very good one provided by Microsoft, testconnectivity.microsoft.com, and we can use to test everything. There's also an EWS editor available from Coplex, which you can find on GitHub as well. Well, for details of how to handle the integration with Exchange Online, I've obviously talked about the setup for 2013 and 2016. Then you need to refer to the Help Center and documentation. So just go to help.sagecrm.com. Let's now turn to how we can configure the integration with inside Sage CRM. There are a number of questions that we need to consider. How do we enable the Exchange integration? How do we create the Exchange connection? How do we, in fact, define an alternative sync engine location? And how do we then go on and select the users for the Exchange sync and manage the process of the synchronization? Oh, enabling the integration is pretty much straightforward. We have to deliberately turn on the definition screens for the integration within the system behavior screens. And then once we've done that, then we'll make that makes the Exchange integration area visible within inside the email and documents menu. And if you've tested, and we are sure that we've tested our Exchange Web Services endpoint, then what we can do is use that, because it's valid, within inside the configuration screens. And this is for the connection. So we can provide the connection to our endpoint in the form of whatever the server is, /ews/exchange.asmx. And please note, if it's not been tested, if it's not validated, it's not true, the connection will not save unless a connection can be made. And so you actually need to know, in order to make the connection, what the endpoint is, and then the valid user, Exchange server user that you've set up, and their logon in order to be able to do this. Now that's just the setup. We can potentially, at this point, say this is where we're allocating a separate sync engine location. This is important when we are working with multi-server environments, multiple Sage CRM, as in a larger implementation. So have a look at the documentation around that. There is the possibility that the sync engine, moving it off to a different location, could provide you with a small performance gain, because you're taking the EWS processing away from the current server, but it's likely to be limited because ultimately we're using the same database, and the Sage CRM endpoint, all of the Sage CRM implementations instances would be pointing to the same database. So moving it off to a different server may have limited benefits. But we've got the idea that we can select users for the Exchange sync. So we go ahead deciding which users are going to be synced. Then we need to, within the administration screens, go into the enablement of the synchronization. Once it's enabled, it's going to show its status dynamically. We're going to be thinking about the when the last sync took place. We're also going to be thinking about the way in which synchronization affects performance. You can make synchronization continuous by setting the value to 0, but that's unlikely to be a good thing in the long run, because although you may have an initial good user experience, there's likely to be a drag on performance. All of this means that there are, and whatever I've discussed from the Exchange all the way through to testing the connectivity to the EWS, granting the rights to the user, there are a number of different points of failure for our integration. So these are the areas that we need to be very mindful of when thinking about support. Do we have the correct impersonation rights? Can you actually access the EWS URL? Is the Exchange sync engine, which is a Java Tomcat web app, is it correctly configured? Is Tomcat itself running? And you've got the system health check pages to help you with that. Have you got any wrong settings to allow for the connection through to the EWS folder? So have we got the right web service or web server IIS settings there? Well, if we step on and think about the synchronization, there are a number of factors that do affect the synchronization. This, of course, is the initial sync, which is going to be the large amount of initial time that takes place. We can think about the number of mailboxes to be synced, the amount of data that's got to be moved backwards and forwards. We can think as well, we can fine-tune exactly how the sync occurs, which way. Are we just pulling down from Outlook, or are we just pulling down from Exchange, or are we pushing up? We can think about the issues around duplication. We can think about the configuration of the CRM database itself and the resources available to it. We can think about the server itself as well, and does it have enough memory? Does it have all of the server processing capabilities that it needs? And we may want to also think about how we can stagger the introduction of more and more people to the Exchange syncing as well. Now, I've discussed all of this really in the context of the setup. When it comes to any problems that occur, and I outlined there are different problem areas, there is a complete discussion of the logs inside the Sage CRM Help Center, and these are all possible to be fine-tuned in certain ways. So you can go to the Help Center, have a look at the documentation that discusses the logs. Now, when it comes to the operation of the integration, this again is covered pretty well. The actual details of what goes on is covered by the videos that are on the Sage Support and Training website. So I'm not going to really dwell on that too much, but all syncing of appointments, tasks, and contacts takes place seamlessly between the Sage CRM and the MS Exchange server. There's no syncing between individual Outlook clients, and because it's on the server, it doesn't matter whether people aren't using Outlook at all, and because it just goes into their mailboxes automatically within the server. So next time when they open it up, it's available to them. And that's pretty much the idea that you can take contacts with inside Sage CRM and push them through and sync them through into Outlook, and you can manually select Outlook and Exchange contacts and push them down into Sage CRM. But when a contact is shared, you'll be very, very clearly identified with inside your user interface with inside the Outlook client, whether that's a web client or not. Interestingly, there's an escalation rule that will notify users about their Exchange integration status. So as soon as they're enabled, it's going to give them a message and say, you've been enabled for Exchange integration. And you can see this within the trigger clause. This really raises the idea that not only can the message displayed be customized, but you could then look at the idea of creating additional rules that could also create notifications based on synchronization status, perhaps. Now, the last thing that I want to consider is something that we've touched on now a few times, which is the idea of deploying the Exchange sync engine to a different remote server. Remember, this is going to be a web app. This is part of Apache Tomcat, and so it's not a service that simply runs. It's got to be set up. Normally it's on the same machine as the Sage CRM itself, but it could be moved to a separate server completely independently from Sage CRM. And so what we need to do that is to go through a number of steps. We need to copy the sync engine files to a already set up Tomcat server. We need to have Tomcat running on that server that we're going to use as a sync engine. We need to make sure that the web app is operating as well, and we also need to be able to make sure that the sync engine is doing what it's doing, what it should be doing, so it's configured correctly. All of this is documented within the system administration guide, and so if you do want to do that, then this is likely to be something that you're going to be doing in the context of a larger scale implementation. Do make sure that you keep up to date with what's going on the Sage CRM community. Lots of very good resources that are available. Thank you very much.